I will do that myself. I'm Geoffrey Bilder. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Crossref, and I was the person who gave the ultra lightning talk yesterday, the one that involved me standing up here and saying thank you, goodbye. This one's going to be a little bit longer, but it's going to be very fast. And you're going to get me twice today, because later on I'm going to actually give the talk that I was meant to give yesterday. Today I'm going to talk about metadata, provenance, and trust. And I don't know whether you noticed, but I'm kind of geeky. I hide it well, but it comes out particularly when I go to, cocktail parties and I'm having drinks with people, and I find myself doing this awkward thing that makes me made me kind of unpopular, still probably does, where I'd spend an awful lot of time talking about identifiers and metadata. And you can imagine at parties, this isn't exactly the height of conversational skill, and people were thinking, what is this guy? Why is he doing this? And I kept trying to think of how can I explain to people what it is about identifiers and metadata that I find interesting? Because of course most people think about identifiers and metadata as being mostly about efficiencies, about automating things, about a lot of kind of back office type stuff. It isn't something that really grabs you. And finally, I kind of landed a few years ago on what I really think is the essence and the most important aspect of metadata, and that is trust. Now, a few people here, particularly people on the board, know that I've spent an awful lot of my time in the industry talking about trust. So they're going to have seen some of this talk before, but hopefully some of you haven't. This is a variation on a talk that I've been given for a long time. But in the early days when I gave this talk, I used to have some problems. And I just want to check and see if I have these problems still. How many people here, heard the phrase fake news recently? Raise your hand. All right. Yeah. Who has heard of phishing? Who's concerned about the internet being affected by, social media, constructed, content and stuff like that, right? So it's safe to say that most of us think that the internet at the moment has a trust problem. Is that fair to say? And I ask this because in the early days when I'd talk about this, I used to have to describe to people what phishing was. And I have to describe some of the cons that people would try and perpetrate on people online. And I had to try and convince people that this was actually going to get worse. And that was sort of the introduction to my talk. And thankfully, I'm glad to hear that, I'm not glad actually, but at least I don't have to do that anymore. Now, how many people in the room are concerned about dodgy journals that are out there? Yes? Well, I see a few hands. How many people are concerned about some of the fake conferences that seem to be appearing out there that look very much like other conferences? Again, hands up. And finally, how many people are concerned that as there's a proliferation of multiple versions of documents out there, that this is actually going to make things even more confusing for people who are trying to identify content that's trustworthy and that they can rely on, right? So it's fair to say that we also think that we have a trust problem in the academic scholarly communication space as well. And again, this was something that, in the early days, it was a little harder to talk about and a little harder to convince people that this might be the case. So before I go on, I want to give us a working definition of trust, because it's essential, obviously, to most of what I'm talking about. And I like this definition by Phil Windley, right? It's the belief in the veracity, good faith, and honesty of another party with respect to a transaction that involves some risk. And I think that it's critical here that we focus on this issue of risk, right? Because obviously that's the thing. What is the risk that we're talking about in scholarly communication? Well, at the very least, it's wasted time and effort. If you're looking at material that is substandard, that's fraudulent, or that's just not well done, you're wasting your time. You could actually damage your reputation if you publish with somebody who is, turned out to be, a not so above board publisher. or if you end up publishing with a colleague who, you know, who fudges the data, possibly much more. I mean, this is some of this stuff is life or death. This is really serious stuff. So this is the risk that we're facing when we're talking about trust in scholarly space. And one of the things that I like to do is I like to contrast concepts of trust in the internet and sort of scholarly communication, because I think that actually sheds some light on some of the problems that we're having. And this is based on a book that was published, I think, in 2000 by Kieran O'Hara, and it's called Trust from Socrates to Spin. And one of the things that Kieran does is he talks about trust along two axes. The first axis is horizontal, and this is supposed to be a gradient, not a binary. But he talks about local trust and global trust in this context. And what he means by local trust is trust that's personal. Okay, so I know my family, I know my friends, I might be acquainted with somebody, a colleague, and sometimes that trust is transitive, right? That is, if I have a close friend and they trust somebody, then I will trust that other person because my close friend trusts them. But generally, that transitivity isn't too great, right? And it varies greatly depending on the relationship and the kind of transaction you're undertaking. But it's really kind of a very shallow transitivity. Contrast this with what he calls global trust, which is usually trust through a proxy. So for instance, you might trust an auditor. And the auditor goes out in turn and audits many, many, many organizations. And by proxy, then you trust those organizations because they have been audited. So that's an example of global trust. It's got a highly transitive aspect to it. And you can think of other things like this, like universities and things like that, where there's a certain sort of transitivity that's built into it. Now, the big issue with personal trust, with the sort of local trust, is that it doesn't scale, right? It's very hard for you to build a large trust network based on personal interactions, specifically with people. And the biggest problem with proxy trust or global trust is systemic risk. That is, if you lose trust in the auditor, then you can lose trust in almost everything that they've been audited. So that's one aspect of trust. The other axis that he talks about is vertical versus horizontal trust. And by vertical trust, he means trust that's hierarchical. That is, there's some sort of a governance structure involved, and along with that governance structure, there's some form of coercion, some sort of mechanism for ensuring that people play by the rules, or if they don't, doing something like, for instance, arresting them or firing them or sanctioning them in some form. And then sort of at the other end, you have horizontal trust, where it's trust amongst equals. You really don't have a way of enforcing behavior. And the example that he uses is if you go to a corner shop or something like that, and you're unhappy with the service there, you can't go to the corner shop police and say, hey, these people have misbehaved. The best you can do generally in that case is say, well, I'm not going to go to that corner shop anymore, right? Now, what's interesting, again, is that you have problems. So vertical trust is subject to abuse, and horizontal trust is, by definition, not enforceable. Now, what's interesting is when you actually map these two axes together and you look at internet trust versus scholarly trust. Internet trust is largely local and horizontal. That is, even though we've got this amazing technology, I still rely to an unbelievable degree on things like looking at the email address to determine whether or not I recognize the person who's sending me email. Looking at a URL to determine whether or not I'm being phished. Looking at a website and trying to figure out whether this is a bogus website or not. It's amazing that with all of this time, we still are based almost exclusively on these sort of local and then horizontal. Also, there's no internet police. If somebody misbehaves, you can't go and report them. You can't sort of have somebody go and just shut down a site because, now there are some things you can do, takedown notices for some stuff and so on and so forth, but your average person using the internet doesn't have recourse to this. And contrast this with scholarly trust, where you have a highly, and this is the great irony of academia, of course, is that they're all radical as long as they're asking somebody else to be radical and to change their ways. Otherwise, they're a pretty conservative lot, aren't they? Hugely hierarchical, and so, they can be sanctioned if they can be denied tenure, they cannot be promoted, they can be laid off, and it's global, right? In other words, there's sort of lots of different proxy elements. So some of them are the college you went to, the degree that you got. All of these things are forms of proxy trust, all right? And so you immediately see this tension, which is that we've got, we're moving increasingly into the internet age, and we're trying to reconcile these two almost polar opposite views of how you deal with trust situations. Now, there's one thing that we do know, right? And that is that the worst possible way to gain trust is to simply assert, trust me, right? And it's interesting for us to think about why that is, because, and I think this is the issue, is that when you say that, it immediately begs the question, why? What evidence do you have that tells me that I should be trusting you? Give me some reason to, but don't just state it. Don't just assume that I'm going to give it to you because you say you should have it. So trust is actually, it turns out, is a word that I find really problematic. Almost every time I see it, it raises my hackles. And anybody in the outreach group knows this. Whenever they write the word trust, they're like, oh God, Geoffrey's going to come and take that out and complain about it. I much prefer this word, trustworthy, right? Because it implies that what you're doing is giving some sort of reason for people to trust you. You're giving evidence, you're giving some sort of information that allows them to make an informed decision. Now I'm going to do a little bit of a segue here. I'm going to talk about branding. And I'm talking about branding because it plays an important role in scholarly communication, right? And there's a lot of debate about exactly what role it plays and whether it's a good role or a bad role. But some of the things that a brand are supposed to do is it's supposed to serve as a shortcut in a way, right? A heuristic, a tool that you can use to say, hey, in general, this party does the following things, right? They publish stuff that is good, important, relevant, a subset of those. And I'm not going to get into the huge debate, a real debate and an interesting debate about whether the publishing industry does these things well, which ones are actually things that they should be doing and which ones aren't. But these are the kinds of things that the brand, over time, it serves as a shortcut, you hope, for these things, right? You see that brand, you say, okay, at least that information is likely to be sound. Again, it's a heuristic, it's not a rule, but it's one that we use very often. But that heuristic, that brand, we get obsessed with it. One of the things that we forget about is underneath there, and I'll use the overwrought image of the iceberg here because you have to, but underneath that, there's a lot of other stuff going on. There are a whole bunch of heuristics that we use to determine whether or not that brand is good, that brand is built on, right? And let me just explain this by giving you an illustration. I want to play a game with you, all right? What's that? It's an article. Was that a board member? No, I hope not. Okay. It's an article. Now, how can you tell that? Isn't that kind of weird that you can tell that that's an article? You can't read any of it. Now, what's even weirder is that you can tell what parts of it are. What's that? The title, okay. And what's that? Oh, sorry. What's that? Yeah, and authors and affiliations. Isn't this weird? Do you remember being taught this? No? But you can instantly recognize this. You instantly know that this is an article. And you can go in and you can do it. What's this? Of course. And you can go on, and if I wait, let me just ask you one more question. What's the discipline? Now that's interesting, isn't it? You have no idea what the discipline is. What language is it in? Chances are it's English, right? But that's just a probability. but you can't tell what discipline is. Those conventions, right, apply across disciplines. It doesn't matter whether it's the humanities or the social sciences or the sciences. You recognize these things for what they are. And in this case, this really was a random article. I've actually never even read it. And I've been giving this presentation for a long time. But you can all recognize this. And you can go back and you can go and look at other things, right? You know, what's this? Right, okay, what's that? Oops, sorry, that. Yeah, I mean, this is crazy. You can identify all these pieces. Now, I'm going to talk, one of the things that I think is interesting about these pieces is that they all serve a very important role in the document. And that is they are an apparatus for rapidly navigating the document and understanding essential information about it. Like who did it? Where are they from? What does it refer to? Right? When was it published? All of this information, all of that apparatus has been so standardized, we've never learned it, but we've internalized it completely. And of course, there you go. Okay, and I'm going to skip this. Oh, wait, actually, you can go further. If I tell you that, that red is numbers and yellow is punctuation, can you tell me what yellow, red, yellow is? I think I heard somebody say citation. Yep, it's a citation. So if you look at this, you can even recognize patterns within the system that show you, and you can see exactly those are citations. It's gotten so bad. Can you tell me what this is? It's another article. I'm going to answer for you. Except that it's not. This is an automatically generated article by a system built at MIT that generates fake articles. You just put in a bunch of author names, and it will generate a fake article with a fake title and put it up there. So these conventions are so standard that you can actually fake the system. You can create a pretend article, and it looks like it. And it has all of the sort of semiotic aspects that trigger you to think, this is serious stuff. I have to look at it. That's interesting. Now, here's a web page. Can you tell me whether this is academic or not? No? Well, turns out it is. Here's another one. Can you tell me whether it's academic or not? Turns out it isn't. So that's interesting too. So many of these things that we've taken for granted in the print world have been stripped, taken out of the electronic world. We don't have them anymore. It makes it harder for us to use these heuristics for assessing the content. It also, incidentally, makes it a little harder for us to navigate the content because everybody's doing slightly different things on different sites. We don't have that kind of standardization. Perhaps this is one of the reasons that people keep going to PDFs, is because at least it's familiar to them. So the point of this is that we didn't think of this, but there's this mechanism, and there are these heuristics we use for judging content and for handling content that lie below the surface, right? And this is the point that I like to make is that there's this provenance infrastructure that sits underneath brand. Every brand started out unknown at some point, and they had to do something to build up that brand. And the thing that they adopted, all of the things that they adopted were this stuff down here, right? This provenance infrastructure. They adopted that because that is the convention, that's what's expected in the community, and so you get all of this information in there, like, what is this? What's the identifier? Where can I get it? Where's the location of it? What refers to it? What cites it? What does it cite? What's been done to it? Has it been peer-reviewed? Has it been double-blind peer-reviewed, single-blind peer-reviewed? Has it been checked for plagiarism? Who provides stewardship for it? So if, sorry about the spelling there, so that if it needs to be updated or corrected or retracted, that somebody knows who's supposed to do that. Who do we credit it to? What are their credentials? Who are they affiliated with? These are all things that we encode in a very highly specific way in our industry, and brands are built on this. Now, eventually, if a brand does its job well, and it does all of this stuff, and it either delivers on these things that it's good, important, sound, whatever, then the brand starts serving as a very useful heuristic shortcut for saying, if I go to this brand, then I can at least be assured that these kinds of things might be happening, right? Now, this is a diagram that was from John Walensky and published a long time ago, 2005, and it's about the, I was just looking for basically a flow chart of the scholarly publication process. And this focuses on OJS, which is an open journal system. And I've modified it a little bit, right, to make it more generic, because we've also got, like, either payment at publication or payment on, on delivery. And this actually, I think, represents a tiny subset of what publishers generally do if they're doing their job. I see Ginny waving frantically back there. I've got 16 minutes on this thing, but anyway. And so there's an awful lot going on here. One of the problems here, of course, is that if things are going smoothly, publishers in the past thought that it was a virtue to hide a lot of that stuff, right? And they wanted the system to sort of just be a box. You submit something, and if it's really good and it's okay, then it's going to come out the other end, and you're not going to have to go through a lot of first. This was considered a virtue, right? Hide this stuff. Who wants to see the plumbing? Who wants to see all that gubbins, right? But there's a problem here, and it's just been outlined in an interesting article, time to stop, stop talking about predatory journals. And the point that they make is that, this term conflates two things. It conflates people who are just not doing their job, right, with people who are trying to purposely be deceitful. And the problem you have is when this part is invisible, it's hard to tell which it is. Is that part invisible because they're doing a good job and everything's just running smoothly? Is it invisible because they're doing nothing at all and basically they're just collecting money and sticking stuff out the other end? Or is it something in between? Without that information, you don't really know what's going on. And this is why this information down here starts becoming so important. A lot of the stuff that goes on in the publication process that is currently hidden, do you check for plagiarism? Do you make sure that the researchers have signed off on, and made sure that they're adhering to animal or human testing guidelines, that they've registered protocols? All of these things are done, but a lot of that metadata just stays with the publisher. It's never exposed. And so I think one of the things that we're going to start needing to do is we're going to need to figure out how to expose that. Christine Borgman has a fantastic quote. Provenance, right, is both more and less than metadata. It involves the origin and history of something and documentation of the chain of evidence, critically, custody, and relationships to other things. So metadata, the metadata that we're gathering in the manuscript tracking system that we're not exposing could serve the same function that all of that apparatus serves in the PDF, to give people heuristic cues about what's been done, whether serious effort has been taken to make sure that this content is worthy of trust. So the next time you're involved in a conversation about metadata and you're having drinks, remember that you don't have to just dwell on like schemas and things like that, that essentially the real import of metadata is that it's going to allow us in the future to document in detail what is being done to the manuscripts that we process. And if we expose that, right, it is going to be another heuristic, not a rule, but a tool that people can use, just like the tools in the PDF, that structure, to try and assess, to try and rapidly make some sort of assessment about whether or not that content is relevant to them, what's been done to it, what the possible quality is of it. And this is basically my message. Thank you.
Yeah. Any questions for Geoffrey?
Oh, didn't you?
Do we need to expose everything, or what about just the peer reviews? Because I think that solves predatory journals instantly.
So my answer would be, who knows, right? And it may vary across disciplines. And to the degree that you can expose it, if you do have it in machine-readable form, I think that one of the experiments that we need to be conducting is expose it and see what becomes important, right? If it does become really important that you expose funder information because, the Templeton organization is funding a whole bunch of research in this area, and it might be useful for you to know that, then in a particular discipline, that might be more important than another. So I'd say that it's up to the disciplines to decide that. Any other